hardware stuff.
The way it's certainly that are extremely literate in this area. It's kind of the way they know and they bookmark because it's good, which is a lot. But they also know how to extract names that they
So we cover like 6 months of software
they're very good, but they're not really fired up.
We need to.
All right.
All right, well, welcome. Thank you all for coming. For some of the new faces, quick couple things is I don't do a lot of fluff. Socially you can, we'll do all the conversation, but I just get right at it. I try to get a couple speakers that spend their time speaking. We save all the questions till the end. Okay, we want to give you as much knowledge as we can during the presentation, and I believe that the speakers can do a better job of their own bio than I can do for them, so I'm not going to do it twice. I'd like you to welcome Chris.
Thanks, guys. You guys can hear me in the back?
What?
Yep. All right. Like you mentioned, I'm Chris Hsiao. I run Gossamer, which is a product development firm based out of Dallas, Texas. And today I'm going to be talking about mechanical engineering and how that sort of relates to the product development flow. So a little quick introduction to Gossamer. This is my bio here, and Will, who was our lead mechanical engineer, he was supposed to come with me, sort of field any deeper mechanical engineering questions, but he's got like a stomach virus. He hasn't been at work all week, so he's not going to be here today. And this is our team at TechZenit. So I'll give you a little macroscopic view of Gossamer. I started it about 2 years ago. I had done aerospace engineering. Graduate of UT and did aerospace engineering for about a decade before that. Worked with Boeing 787, did that for about half of my career, did some drone work, some R&D, some flight test vehicles. And then about 2 years ago, I was consulting for a company and they went out of business. And so I took that engineering work and we started our own engineering firm. And then knowing how the aerospace market was, being super cyclical based on the economy, I decided to also get into product development. We shared a lot of similarities in terms of having the same overhead, the same skill set in the mechanical and aerospace engineering department, as well as just having a few connections that could sort of help me get this going. And the idea of this was sort of to be an investment tool for my engineering firm where, since aerospace was so cyclical, I could do this and work with some startups, take some equity cuts or royalty cuts, and hopefully that would kind of help us get through any dry times. I did that for about 1.5 years and kind of realized that it was way more fun than aerospace engineering. And owning my own engineering firm was just awful. It was just awful. It was so tough. It did okay, actually, so I divested myself from that. Took a few of the guys on the team, and we got acquired by TechZenit. As you can see right there, they are a UX and design team as well as a software team. They do front-end, back-end, apps, websites, everything. And we had used their design team for a couple of projects. And when I started to go this direction, they acquired us. They have about 150 people in their company. They've got offices. We're based out of Dallas. They also have a design team out of Portugal and a secondary development team out of India, and they also have a team in Mexico as well. So moving on to that, these are our advisors and sponsors for Gossamer. Rick Yang, he's a partner at NEA, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with any of the VC firms, but NEA is a pretty huge firm. Scott Miller, I mean, if you guys are in hardware, you might have heard of him before. He runs Dragon Innovation as well as a partner at Bolt. And then MakerBot is a sponsor for us. They make 3D printers, and they're really low-res 3D printers, but kind of for what we do, it's fantastic. We can iterate daily and make our models in SolidWorks, print these things out in a couple hours, get a good feel for it, and just keep moving on. So this is sort of the process flow in which we work, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these. In fact, these are the ones I'm going to be going through. But this is how we typically approach a hardware startup project. And this is strictly for the mechanical and product side. Is we first start with research and kind of find out what the constraints are for this type of project. And then from there we go on and do a conceptual design of it as well as a feasibility study. And once we have that sort of figured out, we then go to this, this is all of the, I guess, harder engineering. I shouldn't say harder, but more technical engineering. And that's with the embedded design, the systems, the PCB, the mechanical engineering, and then the stress engineering. And this is a very cyclical and iterative process, and it takes a while, and every part sort of works together. And then from there, once we kind of have what we need in terms of a physical product, we then go to BOM creation, which is the bill of materials, because that's useful just in terms of accounting, but also figuring out what costs are. And then on that end, we then go to DFM check, design for manufacturing, as well as actual manufacturing. And we do some consulting with manufacturing, not much, and that's not our specialty, and I don't think that's ever going to be something we're going to get into. I don't know if you guys, if anybody out here does manufacturing or has experience with manufacturing. It's a beast, and especially if it's in China or Mexico, there's a whole language barrier. So it's something that we'll help out with, but we're never going to advertise that as our specialty. So I'm going to start right here with kind of the research handoff. When I was making this deck, I was doing a Google image search on business constraints for a product, and all of these things came up. And there's just a ton of ways to define a project and how you can constrain it. And so rather than picking an image, because it's different for every project, right? Some of your constraints could be costs, it could be design, it could be engineering, timeline, risk, but realistically it's going to be everything you see and then just some other stuff that you haven't honestly thought of. And so that's kind of why we really push the research services on our company. And I'm not trying to push my company, but even if you're doing it yourself, you really need to do a ton of research up front, and that's either on-site, research with the users, or some sort of simulated research, so that you kind of figure out what the user is going to experience and where those constraints are going to be. Because once you're 30–40% of the way into this project and you realize, I didn't think about this, it's going to be costly and it could kill you in terms of going back. So in terms of constraints and having some sort of concept, right, there's a lot of different ways we can look at this. There's going to be different constraints, right? So we've got Snapchat Spectacles right here on the left. I don't know if you guys have ever played with it. It's a cool product, but those constraints were pretty much based on design. If it didn't look good, if it looked horrible on your face, nobody was going to get it. And it didn't fit Snapchat's brand image. So they had to get this really great design. It had to be a great wearable. And then they had their electrical engineering team and their sensor team just kind of deal with it. And I don't know, there's a couple of videos out on YouTube where they take apart the spectacles, and it's a stacked PCB. It's really clever, really high-tech engineering for $130. It's a fantastic product. And then on the other end, you've got like a router, which we're not super concerned about design, and so that constraint won't be the design. It's effectively just a utility, and as long as the antennas can point in all different directions and get you signal throughout the house, then you're good. So you don't have any constraints in terms of design there. It's mostly sensors, and then you've got something in between, like the Fitbit right here, which they've got to have these great HR sensors, these great pedometers, accelerometers, everything there, but it's also got to look aesthetically pleasing. And so these are kind of the products we like working on. Something in the middle where we're given a lot of challenging constraints, but that'll work with any project really. And then moving on from that, once we get this conceptual design, before we hand that off to the client, and this is something we've gotten caught up every once in a while, is we get this beautiful design from our design team. We're so excited to show the clients, but then we actually start thinking about it, and we're like, there's no way this can be made. It could be as simple as, we can't make this out of one piece of plastic just because you can't manufacture something like this. Or it could be like this drone here. This is the Teal drone, which was, it's a product that we're working on. It launches at the end of this month. There's going to be a race version and then a full-fledged version in October. It's the fastest production drone, and this was the conceptual design on the left-hand side. Really pretty, very Apple-inspired. But then once we started working on it, we realized that the middle chassis couldn't be 13 millimeters. You've got to fit the PCB in. You've got to fit the NVIDIA TX1 in. And these are these components that we knew had to go in. So we had to measure them all out and just do a rough stack, try to figure out just really what can we present the client. So, you can present them a pretty design and tell them, maybe this is what it looks like on paper, but in reality we might grow a millimeter or 2 millimeters, and that may not be a deal breaker, but you do want to be as honest and upfront to clients. And I'm speaking about this as if you guys are starting consultancy, but the same goes with kind of when you have a hardware product, you can't fall in love with whatever conceptual design you have. You have to be realistic about what the physical limitations are on something like this. So then once you've got that conceptual design, you then go into some of the more technical engineering, and that's kind of what I'm here to talk about. I'm going to skip the embedded systems and the PCB design, partially because I'm not great at it, to be honest, and it's really not my specialty, but there's lots of presentations on that as well. We're going to go into the more of the mechanical engineering side, since I was an aerospace engineer by background. So this is going back to that Teal design. This is what the engineering product looked like, the 3D CAD file. And there's a lot of different CAD packages that you can buy out there, and they vary in price as well as kind of their capability. We personally like to use SolidWorks. That's from our aerospace background. That's a really common software package, and the cost it's manageable. I mean, if you're bootstrapping a startup, it is a little pricey. Onshape is doing some fantastic things as well, and they're at $100 a month. So, if you're smart about it, you can get that thing knocked out in a year and only pay $1,200, and you can discontinue that license if you wanted to, or something. In the long term, they're going to be about even, assuming you don't upgrade your SolidWorks package. That if you do upgrade it, it is about the same annual cost as well. And then we've got different CAD packages like Inventor, ProE, CATIA, and those are going to be a little higher end on the spectrum of professionalism, but their file management is a lot better as well. And it depends on kind of what you're familiar with as well. And then once you kind of have your CAD package picked out, this is kind of how we organize our product, right? This is sort of an aerospace look at it, but it's really not all that different. You've got a lot of parts that feed into an assembly, and that assembly then needs to be installed. Now with aerospace, it was literally like parts that made a box that got installed into an airplane. the installation on this may not necessarily be as organized as this is, but it still is useful to think about it in this way when you are creating your engineering drawing. So on the right side, you've got the SolidWorks screenshot, which has all these part pieces that then fit into the part assembly. And it's really critical to, I know as people sort of toy around and they name part 1, part 2, part 3, and they don't keep good version control, and at the end of the day you have this assembly and it's a mess and you don't really remember what was going on. I would definitely recommend you take every step necessary to keep yourself super organized, because that will come back to bite you. And then another aspect that you do need to look at when you're doing mechanical engineering is tolerancing. Not a super sexy topic, but every part you're going to have is going to be, let's say, 12 millimeters, and then you've got to define what the tolerance on that part is. And so a typical standard that a lot of people use is ISO 2768, and that's sort of, I don't know if you can see it, but it says, let's say, you've got a 3 millimeter product. If you want a super fine tolerance, it's going to be plus or minus 0.05 millimeters. So anywhere between 2.95 to 3.05 millimeters is an acceptable part. So, I mean, you would think you would just want the finest tolerance, except that that's going to cost you money. All these parts, as they roll off the factory, are going to be inspected. And if you've called out for a 0.05 millimeter, then anything that doesn't meet that criteria gets tossed in the trash. That's your money in the trash. So you've got to understand, it goes back to the constraints as what your product is and how fine the tolerance needs to be. If you're making an iPhone, you probably want it to be toleranced as finely as possible. If you're making a router, I mean, if it's got a gap of a millimeter, is that really hurting anything? It may not be. And that's kind of, I personally, coming from aerospace, and just my personality, I hate going with something that has like a coarse tolerance. It just feels gross because I feel like I just want to do the best job I can. But then when you start paying for it and they throw away 30% of your parts, you're going to kind of take that one on the chin and wish that you didn't have so much pride. So that's the basics of tolerance. But then if you have an assembly with multiple parts together, then you have to account for that tolerance as well. And there's different ways about doing that. You know, you could do a linear tolerance. So if everything's plus or minus 0.05 millimeters, then if you've got 3 parts coming together, then your max tolerance is going to be plus or minus 0.15 millimeter. And you need to be sure that your product is okay with that. Something that wasn't necessarily okay with that, and I think it might be speculation, but you know, the rumor is that the Samsung Galaxy, they didn't have enough tolerance for that battery, and as it expanded, it didn't have enough room for the battery to grow. And I don't know if there's any Samsung people here. I'm sorry if I'm shitting on your product, but I mean, the thing was catching on fire. And I don't know if it was technically, if it was necessarily a tolerance product or if it was the battery team that didn't account for it, but sometimes you do want to leave yourself a little more room. The other method, well, there's a lot of methods for tolerance stack up. The other one is root sum squared, and that gets into more statistics based. There's a little link here, and I'll send this deck out to whoever wants it, and you guys can follow these links and kind of figure out how to reduce that tolerance stack up and still be within an acceptable range, because you do want to build up a lower tolerance, but you don't, again, want to throw away a ton of products. And then probably the next part you're going to need to know as you're designing this product is how it's made, right? And this is a plastic injection molding machine. This comes from a YouTube video, which this guy, engineer guy, he's fantastic on YouTube. Again, there's a link for this video, and that's kind of what this whole running Gossamer has been a lot of YouTube videos, and I hope that's the same for everybody, because there's just way too much information out there. But I bring this up because you do need to know how these products are manufactured. If it's plastic, you need to know how plastic parts are manufactured. If it's metallic, you need to know how that's manufactured. And I'll get into that a little bit later, well, right now actually. So if it's plastic, right, there's 2 cavities and it pulls it off. And you have to make sure it can pull it off. If you're doing a metallic part, you're just going to design for kind of exactly what it needs to be, and every line's going to be perfectly straight, because metallics are a little easier to work with that respect. But if it's plastic, and you've got to pull a part off, and it has negative draft, which is kind of, it's tough to explain. So let's say we're pulling a product off like this. I can't pull that female cavity off if there's a negative draft. So you need a positive draft of about 1 to 3 degrees. That's kind of the rough industry standard, and that depends on your manufacturer. And so, as you model these products up, that's something that you do have to be concerned with. SolidWorks and most CAD packages have great draft analysis tools built into it. It's pretty simple. You kind of just show which the draw direction is and what the reference plane is in terms of where you're pulling that apart. And then it'll usually be a pretty easy color scheme where green is positive draft, yellow is neutral, and red is negative, and you just kind of figure it out and fix it as you need to get it done. You can do this on your own. There's a lot of great manufacturers who do this for you, but you lose some control in that regard, and it's worth knowing the product in terms of just every detail. In my opinion, it's worth knowing every detail and why things are designed the way they are, because eventually you may face a failure in that product, and you don't want it to be because the manufacturer in China thought, well, we can make it easier if we pull it this direction, and now you've got a bunch of products that are being returned. Again, this is more in knowing your product and knowing your material. And this gets into an even more technical aspect of it, is with your constraints, you need to know how strong these materials are. And so most materials, plastics as well as metallics, come with spec sheets. The metallics, I find them on MMPDS. That's a old military standard, and then the plastics are usually coming from the plastic manufacturer. And you need to know how strong these products are if it's a product that strength is critical. So we have a client that does a kid's laptop. So if I drop that from about 3 feet, it can't shatter. We can do a number of things. We can make prototypes of this laptop with the plastic that we're doing, and we can just drop it 50 times, figure out what the hell happened, whether it broke or it didn't. Or we can simulate it. And to do that, we need to at least pick out the right material with the strongest properties that's also economically feasible. So that's where we sort of get into strength. It starts getting really down that rabbit hole. If you don't want to go the testing route, you're going to have to go the testing route at some point, but if you want to reduce the cost of testing route, you might get into finite element analysis. And this is the drone center chassis again, and what I did here was I modeled it in a finite element analysis software package and simulated crashes to make sure that the material we chose as it crashed, where the failures were and whether we needed to strengthen it, or in some cases drive failure to a part that can be replaced. It's a little bit, it gets a little grimy in that sense, because you probably could design a product that wouldn't break, but then people may not buy replacements, especially replacement accessories, and a lot of times that drives the business. And it's a decision you're going to have to make, but again, that goes back to constraints and knowing what you want to do. There are a whole host of finite element packages. SolidWorks has one that's sort of baked in. It's okay, and honestly, if you're not doing anything in terms of a crashing car or an airplane crashing, you're going to be okay with that one. ANSYS works with startups a lot, and they sponsor startups, and you can usually get their software package for about $10,000. Autodesk Nastran and MSC Patran are ones that I used in aerospace, so kind of hold a place in my heart. But if you were bootstrapping your own startup, you really wouldn't go that route, because that's going to be way overcomplicated, and it's going to cost you a good years of salary. SimSolid is one that's built on Shape. They're kind of a startup, and their package is about $200 a month. And I really like these types of monthly fees, and that if you kind of know what you're going to do, you can get in and out in a couple months and save yourself a lot of money in the long run. So the finite element process, and if this is getting too dull, let me know, or but it might be useful. It's not super complicated like, if you've done it before. If you haven't done it before, it is a little tricky, but there's a lot of resources available on the internet, and we can help out as well. But typically you import that geometry that you made in SolidWorks or whatever 3D CAD system you have, and then you define and apply the materials and properties. So, you know, it's got this, you need to know what material you're analyzing, right? So you give it all its physical properties, and then you mesh that geometry, which is basically adding a square mesh or a tetrahedral mesh that has little nodes everywhere. And what you're doing is creating this giant mathematical matrix, and it's going to solve that matrix for you. And then you constrain the part, because you can't just push something into space and expect to have any reactions. So you need to at least have some sort of constraint so that you can apply the loads, and then you see what happens. Basically, you see where the failures are, and you see if you can fix that. And I say this like it's an easy process. Usually the last step isn't easy. This is, every time I run a finite element analysis, I think of Jurassic Park, where Samuel L. Jackson goes, "Hold on to your butts," because I honestly have no idea what the hell's going to happen each time I run it. It usually fails. I've probably had a successful run off my first try a handful of times in the past decade. And so, I mean, it's like with anything else, you're just going to debug, but ultimately it will save you time and money. So, once you've got all of that, and I know that was a lot, but that was all pretty top level, and if we want to get further in depth, there's time for that some other time. Then you create a BOM. And this sort of gets more into manufacturing, but assuming that you've been keeping really good track in your 3D CAD system, it should be really easy to export that into Excel or Google Sheets or into Dragon Standard BOM, which is a little Google Sheets plugin that Dragon Innovation created, and it's great too. And again, with the BOM, it's knowing how to organize your product, knowing where the sourcing is coming from, paying attention to the costs, and just being generally on top of your hardware product, because it will get super complicated really quick. That's about it.
We're a touch ahead of schedule, so we'll do a couple questions, but what we want is the questions to be generic for the group, not specific. So,
may I ask my generic question?
yeah.
Thermal analysis, I mean, that's a big issue in a lot of systems. Is you got dissimilar materials, like you got metal components holding plastic and stuff. Is that something that you really simulate? And you know, you talk about tolerances, but you know, everything moves around so much with thermal coefficient of expansion type stuff.
So metallics, unless you're going super high temperatures, I'm talking 600-700 degrees Fahrenheit.
No, I'm not talking about
Okay, then you should be
normal.
okay.
Yeah.
Plastics will expand, and those are going to be in your spec sheets. And that's why you do need to build up that tolerance, and that is available in software packages. And that's something that we do analyze, but it's super technical. And so it's no longer necessarily a linear analysis. It gets to nonlinear stuff. And
does the software packages do the thermal analysis as well?
They do. Those packages cost even more because they're usually like little add-ons to it. And if you haven't done any of that analysis before, for you to say, I want to do a full thermal analysis, that would be difficult. So find somebody else to do it is my advice. It doesn't have to be us. Just don't spend a year trying to learn it, because you're going to do it once for one product. It's not going to be worth it. Yeah.
I noticed that a lot of the materials you're working with are homogeneous, like the single plastic. Does it get complex really fast when you start dealing with heterogeneous, like matrix materials?
Yeah, it does in a way. You can definitely account for that if you were going to, say, do finite element analysis, right? Because that's what you're going to use a heterogeneous material for, is probably for greater strength in one direction versus another. And you can build that layup in that property if you're doing finite element analysis, and it's really not that difficult. Or you could use different types of software that sort of optimize what type of material you need to use, or if you're, say, using carbon fiber, what the best layup would be, so that you could reduce the amount of layers and still get that strength that you need. So it is something that can be done in software, and there's a few workarounds if you're using a cheaper software, and then as the cost gets more expensive, you're completely getting what you pay for. Then you'll start being able to see where the failure modes are within each of those layers, or which direction causes the failure.
So what's your ability to move from one software package to another? Let's say you start off with one of the cheap ones that's the $100 a month, and
Yeah.
then you decide you want to move to Pro E.
Yeah.
Do they handle translating between?
Oh, they absolutely do, and that's, you can usually export the files into STL files or a whole host of files, and some of them come with the properties with it, some of them will just be purely a geometry file, but they're all pretty interchangeable. And if you're talking about 3D CAD packages, Onshape, it's a huge team, and most of them came from SolidWorks, and so the usability of that versus SolidWorks is very similar, and the file format's very similar as well.
Okay, we're going to have time afterwards, and then we can get more specific. I'm actually going to come on up.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Drew, for inviting me. My name is Steve Pearson. I'm going to be really impressed with Chris here. I met him on the elevator up, really nice guy, but I knew he was really solid because he said two things during his presentation that really impressed me. First is that you should do some research up front before you get into this big design, build, project thing. That's really important, so it's nice to do some of that at least in the early stages, so that was a great hit. But also he made a reference to Jurassic Park, which I'm not going to mention specifically in here, but nonetheless there's going to be something that's really close to that, and I'll share that for you. So if you do me a favor, Drew, and hit me the 10-minute warning if I get a little close. I'm going to try to keep it exactly at 40 minutes. So this presentation is designed to teach you how to do your own patent research. And so I'm trying to consolidate and give you a backbone of how to do that, some structure. And I only have 40 minutes to do it. The tools that you have available to use for free aren't perfect. Maybe you have little or no history in doing patent research, so take it with a grain of salt. I'm going to give you a backbone that you may find appropriate for your own needs, or you may see a better way to do business in your own way. And certainly feel free to do that, because patent research is an art. It's part science, but it's definitely part art. So let's get started. By the way, this is only focusing on the IP portion of research. So you could look at newspapers and technology research and all sorts of other things that are considered prior art, but I'm only going to focus on the intellectual property part of it. So quickly about me, I'm not going to dwell on this. I have two different companies. I've been doing patent research and innovation strategy development for a lot of years, 10 years now. And I have some of my own patents in the hardware space. They're being licensed right now, so they have not been built. And I do a lot with IEEE, so if you're interested in energy or power, that's something that's very interesting to me. I was in the Navy for a little while.
So there's lots of ways to describe my company or not describe it. My wife still struggles to know what I do, and that's fine. That's my fault, not hers. But what my company does is that we take long, winding roads, which I'll analogize. Entrepreneurship, inventorship is the same. We take a long, winding road and shorten it and straighten it out. So I'll leave it at that, and that includes doing some patent research along the ways. By the way, my brother hated me when I made him pull over. This is up in northern Idaho, up near the Canadian border. I made him drive a number of miles back around so I could get this shot, and he hated me for it, but it was worth it. It's just my brother. So the agenda today is why you should search. Sometimes we just think about patent search and we don't really think about why we're doing that. The other part is I give you a little bit of a background before we get into the nuts and bolts of it. And then the third step will be the nuts and bolts of how do you go through in a methodical way with your own research. And by the way, how many of you actually started or have done some patent research in the past in any form or fashion? So maybe half, okay? So one of the things that you'll learn, I think, and I know many other people that think the same way, is that if you do your own research, like when you're doing a novelty search to apply for a patent, is that you can save yourself a lot of time and money, especially if that idea is not going to go anywhere. If you are inventing a pencil and you discover a bunch of patents for pencils, you may not have any opportunity, and so you may have just saved yourself $10,000 or more in a couple years of agony as you wait to get a patent on pencils. That's never going to happen. So there's some opportunities to save you some time when you do your own research. And by the way, patent research is also a component of your market research. And many people don't think of it in that way, but there's a lot of market data to be gathered from patent research. So here's something that shows the importance of intellectual property. 87% is the value of the Standard & Poor's 500, otherwise known as the S&P 500. And Ocean Tomo, a very respected research organization, went through and figured out that their value on average of intellectual property was 87%. And so I say that not to surprise you or scare you. I say that as an opportunity because as you're starting a business, think about building your widget. Certainly that's the exciting part, but be thinking about how you can collateralize, maybe through licensing or other opportunities, your intellectual property and expand your portfolio, whether that be patents, trademarks, or something else is immaterial. So be thinking about that as an opportunity. There's money to be made, but maybe there's a lot more to be made by thinking about intellectual property. And at the same time, you're thinking about opportunity, be thinking about your risk. So if somebody else has intellectual property and they say you have infringed upon my patent and it happens to be a Microsoft, Amazon, a very large player, us as entrepreneurs may not have as many resources as they do. And so their $1 million threshold is the minimum threshold for you just to get through the court case and the examination as an entrepreneur. So it's a very large number for most entrepreneurs. And I say that as a word of caution to make sure you know what IP is out there that somebody else may already have. So enough of that. Let's get into a little bit of background. And so one of the things about patent research is that you certainly will be able to walk out of the room tonight and hopefully do a much better job than whatever you have done in the past. That's a given. But be careful because you have to know when you don't know how far you've gotten. And I'll give you a couple thresholds for when to know that. But if you have, excuse me, if you have a lot of money riding on the decision, it's worthwhile to talk with your attorney or someone else about when you should bring in an outside professional. So one of the things I really want to emphasize is, this probably won't work, no, is that patent research is a statistical, there we go, exercise. So you have to know, one, how much time you're willing to devote to it. Just like using some of these software packages, if you're going to only be in it for a short duration and you don't want to go through and learn all the process and divert yourself from the main thing you're trying to build, then it's worthwhile to discuss and figure out, maybe I need to have someone else do this or somebody in my group, figure out how that's supposed to work because you don't want to lose track of what your focus is. So it's a statistical exercise. So how many of you know who this is? Anybody recognize him? Okay, this is Adam Savage, and he's on Mythbusters, or what was Mythbusters. It's off the air now. So Adam Savage is the comic relief for that show. And so the interesting thing about Adam is he says all kinds of things that maybe go past you as a joke, but then you realize, no, there's maybe something more prophetic about it. And so he actually said this at a conference. He said, remember kids, the only difference between science and screwing around is writing it down. And so I'll challenge you that if you're really doing professional grade patent research that's going to be appropriate for your business, that you'll take a lot of notes. And a lot of you may squeam at that, but that may be the standard to say, I'm in the game or I'm not in the game. Certainly doing some freehand, just seeing what's out there is always appropriate, but writing it down is really going to be important. And this whole process I'm going to show you is based on writing things down to keep track of what you're doing, because in essence you're going to end up going back and redoing some stuff. It's just part of the patent research process. So remember kids, the only difference between patent research and screwing around is writing it down. So there are a bunch of different prior art searches, and there's statistical art searches known as patent analytics. I'm not going to cover all those. For now, we're just going to assume we're looking at patentability options. So this presentation is built around that. The nice thing is if you can do this, then it's a real close jump to do these other types of things, like who else has patents in that area that could sue me, and other types of patent research. So here's a few things to think about, and this is going to be important later when you're looking at knowing when you're done, is that there are 5 million patent and patent application publications filed around the world every single year. So that means the odds of something being out there related to your idea is extremely high. And I'll show you why as we get to the end. So that's important to know. Only 25% of those are in the US. So if you're looking at the USPTO, you're only looking at 25% of the world's patent applications and publications. So that's important. If you're filing outside of the US or think you may be having a problem getting a patent because of something outside the US, certainly time to consider your other options. So one of the other things is that a patent research job is just a snapshot in time, and that snapshot in time is actually a year and a half past the time. It's kind of like looking back into the universe and seeing light. That light is not from today, it's from many years ago. And so patent research is like that because most publications, applications especially, publish at 18 months after you file them. And that's just a general rule for around the world. There are always exceptions. But generally think you're looking about a year and a half earlier than what you're really seeing. So the important part of that is that if you're really in the game, you want to go back at 6, 12, or 18 months and go ahead, if you're still in that same area, and look again to see what else popped out, because probably something will come out. And then finally, to get a patent, you're going to be spending about 2 to 3 years twiddling your thumbs, letting your attorney or whoever is filing for you manage the office actions that are being generated and such. So it takes time to get a patent, and so you want to make sure that you're doing the right things before you get into that cycle, which is expensive and takes a lot of your time. So part of the background of this presentation is a patent family, and I'll show you why as we get into the nuts and bolts of this. How many of you have ever heard of a patent family? Anybody? Okay, so a patent family is a bunch of related documents. This particular one is just an example. I just grabbed it. But if you look at this, you'll see some AU, Australia, CA, Canada, China, CN, JP for Japan, US, we remember the United States, of course, WO for the PCT, patent application process. So these are all patents that were filed by the same inventor in the same space on the same priority date. And so one of these documents is probably the priority, but they're all related. They're the same concept. The documents themselves obviously are going to be different according to laws in various areas. But in essence, the point of this is that there are at least 20 documents here. And if we looked at the USPTO for this patent and looked at it, we'll probably get a pretty good idea what the rest of these documents look like, which will save us a lot of work. So that's important. Doesn't mean that these are going to be exactly the same, but for the most part we can ignore them in the early phase. And so this is part of our early funnel of not examining any more than we absolutely have to. With 5 million publications every year, there's a lot for us to look at. You know, I'm just basically a lazy person. I don't want to look at 5 million this year or the previous years. That's a lot of work, and we want to minimize that effort. So I don't know if...
I'm just curious, are you dealing with different languages?
In some cases, yes. The nice thing is that a lot of these, like even Japan, I can't read Japanese, but all of them generally have an English language abstract. Almost all. And because they're all related, even if I couldn't read it, I can know pretty much what's in the contents. So one of the things about families is that they interrelate with all the other IP universe. And so these are called citations, and patent citations are really valuable. And so what I did was I took a snapshot of my patent family from a couple patents and applications, just the top 4 here. And so all the prior art that's referenced earlier than that is all the citations that I found, that my patent attorney found, and the USPTO examiner found. And you can see they're not all the same. You can see this patent here has a bunch of citations. This one has a lot of citations. But look at this application. There's only 2. That may have been the ones that I turned into the office. So the point of this story is that if you know the patent family, you can find some other very related references, but they may not be just to one document. They're all similar, but I found them via different documents. And so let's look at this. If you look down here at the bottom, these are backward citations, and that means things that were discovered at the time these were being created. So we found these because they were older. And by the way, as these get older, it's just a moving time frame, these new patents and applications are going to be citing my patents and applications. And so those are known as forward citations. All of them should produce citations that are related to the core of what I had, but they're in different time frames. So I'll show you how to deal with that later. Does that make sense to everybody? Close enough? Okay. So let's look at a patent publication. And I chose this one, and I'll show you why in just a minute, to understand how to look at the text and realize how to use the text to your advantage. Certainly anybody can plug in keywords into Google and do a search, and you can put the word patent in it, and it may kick you over to Google patents. But to really have a lot of structure in your text searching for patents, you should know what fields you want to look in. So in this case, trailerable robot for crushing vehicles. So there's 5 words there, and those words have a lot of weight. We know it's related to robotics. We know it's related to crushing, some sort of mechanical force. And we know it's a vehicle, so it's probably very large. And then it says trailerable, which is a new word to me, but that probably means it's even larger than maybe what I would have envisioned. And so the point of this is that those 5 words, if you can just search in the title only and find your pencil patent or whatever it is you're looking for, then by all means search in the title first and save yourself a lot of effort. So if you look in the next level of what's an opportunity is the text in the abstract is the next shortest field. And look at all the words in here. We're probably looking close to 100 words. And so you're going to get all kinds of things. Still very relevant, but the content richness has basically faded a little bit. And so you have to account for that. So finding things in the title is going to be really fast. If you start looking here, you may go up at 10 times as many documents, perhaps, is what you're going to find. They may be related, but many of them may not be. So it's a give and take, and you'll just have to assess that as you're doing your search. So that's all on the title page. So the description is the one that my grandma went to the big wolf's house, drove around in a car, she made some candy, did all kinds of stuff. You can literally throw anything and everything into the description page, and I've seen some of these that are so long that they're literally hundreds of pages long, and it's just garbage. So that is there, but realize that if you find yourself off in the description field, you're really hunting for something that may not exist. You're going to be doing a lot of work, maybe for little or no gain. So the next area is usually not as verbose, and that's the claims area, and that's where the real nuts and bolts of the legal boundaries of that patent are extended to. That's the border of your property once you gain it. And so the nice thing is that this is much shorter than the description. However, typically there's a lot of legalese that gets thrown in there. A plurality of tires or some other word that doesn't really have much meaning in the everyday world. And so you kind of have to account for that in how you're doing your text search. And I'll show you as we get into the nuts and bolts what this means specifically. And then finally there's this drawings area. Thank you, Chris, for my great lead into Jurassic Park here. So this is a trailerable robot. You can see the trailer wheels in the back, and then you can see how it's basically a T-Rex. And how many of you actually have ever seen this? Anybody? Okay. So this is a device that goes around entertaining people. And it's called Robosaurus Rex, and he goes around to racetracks. I saw it at the Alamo Draft House on South Congress. 9, 10 years ago, when they had the intro to Transformers and they were making their big splash, this guy was making a lot of bucks, and he was in the Alamo Drafthouse parking lot. So why do I remember that? So here's a life lesson for everybody. A little comic relief. So here's the family before my kids were like 7 and 5. You know, we're standing in front of a robot. You can see my girls hanging onto my shirt. And then later as it got dark, rainy, and we stood up next to the area, you can see the head of this thing has gotten literally right in front of the lady in front of us here. So we're literally talking a couple feet away. He's been blowing fire like 20 feet out of his nostrils. That's one of his many features. He's been literally ripping cars in half. And now you got this Jurassic Park scene where kids are wetting themselves. Literally, he's just a few feet away. And so needless to say, my mother-in-law was in town that day, and my wife also knew what was going on. So that night I had a new bedroom in the backyard. So, not a good story. So, we've talked a little bit about the USPTO and Google in the back conversation I had before this. Realize there's lots of free search engines for doing patent research. They're all fallible. Even the paid ones that are really expensive, they're fallible. They're never going to be perfect. So I don't want you to do the eye chart thing and try to read everything because that's not important. What I do want you to realize is that the coverage of these things is different. Like the USPTO, they just cover the United States. They don't look at Canada, they don't look at Mexico, they don't look at anything else. Google has a broader search capability. You can look in Europe and a few other countries. That's great. And every other engine is going to have various coverages. They all have various capabilities. Sometimes the data shows up early, sometimes they don't have the applications, sometimes like the USPTO, they still generate TIFFs instead of PDFs. They all have their own little quirks, and that's for you to decide what level of quirkiness you're willing to tolerate in your own search. So I cannot stand anything that doesn't generate PDFs, so therefore I would never touch the USPTO with a hot iron. So everybody else may be okay with that. So one of the things to take away from this is that if you try one engine and you don't like it, switch to something else, give it a shot, see if it does any better. But just realize that they all have their own quirks. So let's go down the yellow brick road and figure out how this is all going to work. So as I said before, prepare. Thank you very much, Chris. I think that's essential to getting ready to do your search. And some of the things that you'll want to look at are keywords, synonyms, etc. And then there's this thing called international class codes. And there's other types of class codes, but this is a patent classification system. So if I was holding up my pencil, the USPTO, or I'm sorry, the international class codes have writing instruments as a class code. So it would actually say, wow, if I'm looking for pencils, I can just jump to that one, plug in pencil, and well, voila, I found pencils. So some of the things that we want to look at, I call this the search sandwich. My editor made me take off this greasy, sweaty sandwich that I used to have over here. She didn't like it, but I'll spare you the graphics. Basically, we're going to do 3 different types of searches just to get our base layer of searching done. The first one is word only. I'm going to look for pencil in the title. The second part is I'm going to jump down here to the bottom. Look in class codes. If it's in writing instruments, I'm going to see how far I can take writing instruments down. Can I find pencils in writing instruments? And then we're going to do an amalgamation between the two where we're using terms and class codes together. And you know, this may sound highly redundant, and in some ways it really is, but what you're going to find is as you get into this and put the screws down, is you're going to find unique citations, publications, let's say, in each one of these different methods that you did not find in the other ones. So if you're really doing a thorough search, consider doing all 3 steps of this. And this isn't complete, it's just how you get into the base layer. So, as I mentioned before, you may want to start with the title. It's data rich compared to the verbose other sections of the patents. Look at your class codes. We're going to use the international class code today. And we're going to look at the different groups that it has. And it's just like some of the text sections, they have different sections, you know, big groupings, much finer, 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 so you can really drill in. We also are going to keep apprised of interesting companies and inventors. If we're looking for one-click purchasing, we may want to jump straight to Amazon and see what we can find in there because we know from reading the newspapers that they have this magical patent related to one-click purchases. So company names, sometimes inventors are very prolific in a very specific area that's very common. So you want to keep track of the information that you're looking at to say, wow, that inventor's name keeps popping up. There's something here for me to follow. And then, as I mentioned before, the forward and back citations, we want to leverage those. And then rinse and repeat. Yes, sir?
So the forward citations show up in your search? I guess they wouldn't be in the original document, but
Yeah, they will not be in the original document. The backward citations will be in the original document, but the forward citations won't appear until after those have been published, and maybe 18 months or so you'll start to see a dribble of citations referencing that patent or publication.
but if you're looking at a particular publication, is there something in the search that will tell you what its forward citations are?
Well, I'll show you how to do that, yes. Yeah, Chris?
At what point does white papers become relevant in your searches? Looking for like research.
Let's take that offline. It is relevant, however, no one ever talks about the IP searches, and so I'm going to focus on that for tonight. That's an entire new layer. Good question, though. There we go. So if you look at those 3 bullets that I showed up there earlier, when we do word-only searches, class code searches, and then the combination of the 2 together, we're going to get different results. Sometimes you'll find the same thing in all 3 searches, but there's always, to varying degrees, some uniqueness. And so think about a shotgun pattern, a Boolean diagram, something that says every time you search, even if you change just a couple things, you're going to get a different set of results. It may be closely related to what you want, similar to what you've seen in the past, but the results are probably going to be different. And so here is a little bit of an international class code lesson. Up here in human necessities, it's under a big group called A. When you have, like writing instruments will probably be under A, for instance, pens, pencils, markers, etc. When you're looking at cars, trains, planes, all these kinds of things, they'll be under B, and so on. And so these are some logical steps that people have looked at many, many times to say, how can I classify that invention? And it's not unusual that there could be several different combinations of codes used. And this is the international class codes, that's true for any of them. So if you're looking for electrified pencils, you may see something that's under H for electricity and A for human necessities. So just be aware of that.
I'm curious about software. Would that fit in there?
Yeah, software is patentable, absolutely.
But would it fit in one of these categories, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe generally it's under electricity, which includes software, electronics, things like that. But it's not necessarily. So jumping over to our synonyms, we're getting really close to starting our process for how we search. So one of the final pieces of this is that when I mentioned a plurality, how many of you actually heard the word plurality before? Here it is right here. So when we're looking at like 2-wheel bicycles, it could be written in the patent language as many wheels so that they get as broad a coverage as possible. It could be used as a plurality. That's a very common legal term, meaning more than one. It could be in cases an array, an assembly, yada yada. If you're looking in non-English literature, like in the world patent application process or in even Canada, you want to consider some of the language alternatives. Dos, do, zui, and du. So here's the example where we really get down. What I'm going to use is my wedding band as a simple example. And so the wedding band is, everybody's familiar with it, whether you have one or not, it's immaterial, but everybody knows what a ring looks like. It's also called a band. So there's 2 different terms right there off the bat. And so one of the things that I would challenge you to do when you're writing down everything that's word related to a ring is that write down, just do a free form, what can be rings described as a personal ring, planetary ring, just all kinds of different rings. They aren't necessarily related to the jewelry, but they're all related to ring. And so it's kind of important to just get something on paper and say what kinds of things up there could relate to rings when I'm doing my text search. Phone ringing, sports rings like boxing rings. And so those are all completely garbage finds, and we want to make sure that as we're getting into it that we start keeping track of what the good descriptions are, because we'll probably find some new ones, i.e. we'll need to go back and rerun our previous strategies with those new terms. Like if I didn't include wedding band, we may have to go back and add wedding band to whatever searches I had done in the past. So going through and doing all these different things is really important to kind of set your mind in the right direction and to realize what's related, what is not related, how are they being described. And so for the purposes of my example, I was thinking about an example of what if I could make an adjustable ring? How many different ways are there? Could I patent it? And so what kind of things have been described? And so I wrote down some ways that you could conceptualize making an adjustable ring. You could have some sort of folding, maybe some sort of swiveling, interlock, a latch, some sort of pivot, maybe even magnetic, something like that. And so I just wrote down some terms and some concepts that basically I was keeping track of how could I make something adjustable. So now I have some terms and I've set my mind in the right direction. I want to go look in my class codes to see what is the closest class code or codes, there could be more than one, that relate to an adjustable ring. And so here I went, and in the International Class Code System they actually give you some shortcuts, and so I just said let's look up ring and see what kind of rings they have, and let me see if I can find one that talks about finger rings. And so I found boxing rings, here's finger rings, that's pretty cool, but I also found some ear rings and some other things that may or may not be related. How far is it from an ear ring to a wedding ring? Well, maybe there's some latching stuff, but in some cases they might be one and the same. So just kind of need to make note of that as we're moving through this. So obviously there's a bunch of other rings, engine, piston rings, bolt rings, it's just crazy. And so we want to maybe take a snapshot of this and paste it into our Word document to say, here's some other things that I want to keep a watch on and maybe exclude later as I try to stay away from finding those things rather than what I'm looking for. And so when I go to finger rings, you'll see that here's the structure of the International Class Codes. I have A for human necessities, and underneath that 44 is haberdashery. How many of you have heard of haberdashery? Ah, man. And so as we step in closer to this, we get to jewelry and bracelets. And then down below we see that there's finger rings. That's 9/00. That's really cool. That's exactly what I want to find. And oh, by the way, the one and only subcategory of that is this /02. And so this is a gift from whatever gods you may follow. This is great. You found the exact class code of the thing you're looking for. Is that good or bad?
Bad.
Bad? Why?
Likely you're not got a patentable idea.
Yeah, there's probably been a lot of people before you that have thought about adjustable finger rings, so much so that the patent classification system is now accommodating for adjustable rings. So this may be a bad sign, but it's also a good sign in that it may make your search a lot easier.
Save you a lot of time.
Yes. Where there's opportunity, there's also risk.
10 minutes.
Thank you. So here's what we're going to do. In the USPTO system, we can plug in keywords when you use their advanced search engine. And when you plug in TTL, that means look in the title. And if we look at some combinations of words, we're going to see how many results are over here. And this is the way I keep track of all my results, although I don't use the USPTO engine. And so what you'll find is as you use truncation, ands, ors, and things, is that you're going to get varying levels of results. And this is where the statistical part of patent research comes in, and that you have the mental fortitude to go through 121 results. Probably. 275? Maybe. 9, definitely. But what if you get down to here when I'm searching in the abstract and using some truncation and some Boolean operators, I get to 236. Well, it's larger, that's still manageable, but at some point that number is just going to go through the roof, such as when I start looking in the claims and I get almost 2,000 results. At that point you may say, honey, I'm not coming to bed tonight, I'm going to be up all night reading these stupid documents. Or you may say, that's just too far, I'm going to go that far. So that's for you to decide, no one else can make that decision. So the point of the results is that in the USPTO engine, and all of them are the same, you can copy the results page and literally paste it into a spreadsheet. And so you can take all the results, this is my own numbering system for this search, the USPTO's number, then the title, and I can put that in saying I got that from search 6, which I'm keeping track of so I know exactly how I found those results. So when I paste this in here and add in all the other searches, now I have a bunch of results, some of which will be exactly the same. And when I do a sort by number, now I may see a bunch that are one number, and I can say I don't have to review all of those. I just want to review the one unique one, and if I know it, I'm good. And so as we're going through this, I'll show you in the next slide or two here. So if you look at the class code for that very unique adjustable finger ring, we found 41 results. I'll bet you money that almost every one of those is spot on. It's very unusual if it was not. So these are probably very good results. Every one of them is important to you in some form or fashion. And then if you look at taking the... I'm not going to go there, I don't have time. So if you look at trying to minimize your time, you can do things in the USPTO of and not. And the and not in this case is saying, tell me something that I didn't find before in this search. And so now I'm looking at this next higher level class code for jewelry rings and looking in there, but I don't want to look at these same 41s again. So I found 92, and some of these will not be in the correct category. Some of those will be adjustable. It's kind of sad, but that's just life. So those should be pasted into your sheet under 9. And so then the amalgamation between the text and the class codes is what I call the filler, the middle of the sandwich. And so here we've searched for some class codes, for some terms in the claims of these things that we've done before, and we're going to AND it with this class code for just finger rings. And we're going to find some things. And these are 7. Everybody can review that. And then we back off a little bit and relax what we're doing and expand it. Because we say, well, we probably are missing some things. I only called it ring. I could have called it band, perhaps. And so when I expand that search out, again in the claims, I came up with 18. So that's completely manageable. And if you take the 18, the 7, the 41, and the 92, and you paste them all in your spreadsheet and do a sort on them, you can minimize a lot of your duplicates and you don't have to do a lot of review. And when you do that, this is what I've done, is I've done those examples and pasted them in here. You can just make some quick notes. Just literally by looking at the drawing, you can say piston ring, boxing ring, navel ring, or whatever those things are that are unrelated to you. You can say unrelated, or interesting as I call it here. And so immediately you have started filtering down very quickly to those things that are interesting. And those that are, you can start to classify by things that are important to you, whatever they happen to be. I put a material of metal. Is it folding? Is it locking? Just making a hypothetical example. And so what I'm trying to do is avoid picking up the same sheet of paper at the same time again and again and again, and trying to focus in. So here's the USPTO's references. This is references cited, i.e. what's the prior publications. And if you look at that, when you're looking at any particular document, it'll show you all the citations that were made in the past, the backward citations. And so if you go through here for the ones that you think are really spot on to your idea, but you're not quite seeing exactly what you want, you go flip to the references cited page and you start clicking on these and saying, is this related to my idea? Is it? And what's going to happen is you're going to find a couple in there that you have not found but are very related. And so that's important. And then when you click this one and this one becomes underlined, the reference by, those are the forward citations, the ones that are newer than the publication. And we do the same thing over again. And again, you may find some things that are newer that relate exactly to what you're doing. Paste them in the spreadsheet. If you find a bunch of them, if in this case I had 20, if I found 10 interesting things in this set of results, that means I need to go back and structure how I did my original searches, because obviously I didn't do them very well. This is pointing me to all kinds of things I never found, and I should have found them the first pass. So if you only found one that was interesting, hey, you probably did a pretty good job. So your ratios may differ. That's just the first pass for me. So the results is that if you don't find something that scares the pants off of you, you probably haven't done a thorough search. 90% of the time or more that you do patent research, in my results, at least something comes out that the client says, oh my God, that is terrible. I had no idea there was something that close. Well, with 5 million publications per year, you know, statistically the odds are pretty high. So it's good to know those things. So that's one of my 2 criteria for finishing. The other one is that if you go through all the forward and backward citations of all the highly relevant documents that you have, and you may have 100, so this is not an easy task. If you can do that and not find anything new that is highly related to your idea, then you can say, I did a pretty good job. It's arduous, yes, but that's what we're looking for, is to quantify when are we done, when did we do a good job. So, Chris, to your comment, don't forget the non-IP resources, your technical pubs, and all these other sources of information out there that are not intellectual property. That's a whole different presentation, but that's the one that most people can use Google Scholar or some other sources to at least whinny in pretty quickly without a lot of knowledge. Okay, so that's my 40-minute abbreviated backbone for how to do your own patent research. Any questions? John?
So I hear this term interlocking patent used about kind of patent strategies and for blocking patents and this stuff. Is there a way to tease out from the patent what those are?
If you look at the Boolean diagram of how there's overlap, if you look at a patent, the terms used, the class code, the assignees, you can start to, and the references, the forward and backward citations, you'll start to get a picture of those things around that idea. And so that will bring out some of the interlocking IP that is related, yes. Yes, sir?
What does a typical patent search cost? Does it depend?
I don't want to pitch, so let me talk after. Typically, it's under $1,000. If you pay $300 or less, walk away. Yes?
So how do we do this ourselves in 5 minutes or less for under $10?
Go to Google Patents, plug in some keywords, see what you get, and if you find something great, if you don't be surprised if it comes back later.
So to get somebody to do it right, it's about $1,000, and how many hours does that actually take?
It varies by the company. We can talk afterwards. I don't want to sound pitchy, so. Yes, sir.
A couple of comments. I don't know how long it's been since you don't seem like USPTO, but they do PDFs now. I don't know when they changed over. It used to be a pain where they did text, but they do PDFs now, which is
Good.
a lot better. Also, it's been my observations that a lot of times the titles are, I don't know if it's intentional, but they're sort of don't obfuscate what they're really talking about. You know, they'll call it something that.
I've seen one, I think it was entertainment device, which when I read into it was a skateboard.
Very
So-
generic or even.
And the answer is that some of the times that just happened because they wanted to make it sound nice, and other times they're trying to hide the contents. And so that's done, especially with the title and making it sound like something that's totally unrelated. Because they don't want people to find it, because that's their strategy.
Exactly. Yeah. Come up later.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
So you give the client a list of related patents, but you don't give any subjectivity to like whether this prevents you from, like, is it, when we were looking for IP patents, they were saying you want to do a patent search or not, it's like an option. And then if you did a patent search, then they could look at those and say, okay, that's not something in your realm. Like, you don't say whether this will keep someone from a said invention.
It all depends on the client and the company that's doing the search. For me, it all varies according to client need. And so making a recommendation as a professional, not as a legal expert, that's completely within my realm.
Okay.
Everybody has their own mode of operation. Anybody else?
Just
Yes,
a
sir.
comment, I've used patent searches as a way to develop the vernacular and vocabulary for whatever I'm working on, so that I can then go out and find more content with which to generate a better resolution.
Sure, absolutely, yeah, they're a wonderful starting point. To me, patent research is the cheapest, most overlooked opportunity to figure out a future market, whether you can patent something, and oh, by the way, what technologies were used to make that happen, whatever they are. So it's very quick and easy to, well, I shouldn't say easy, but it's fairly quick in the scheme of reviewing hundreds of technical documents or more to find out what kinds of things have been considered in the past, who was doing them, how did they do it, etc. Yes, sir.
Any AI being developed for patent searches?
Say that again now?
AI,
Oh,
artificial intelligence, like IBM's Watson, doing patent searches?
Yeah, there are. They're still very high end. How good they are, I'm dubious. With all the ways to describe skateboards and bicycles and different things, understanding the context of something often relies on the diagram, the drawing. And I don't know that AI can really interpret text and drawing at the same time. So at some point it may be. I'm not an expert in that area, so it may be coming.
Might be very helpful to narrow the search down to where human can.
Sure, it's a time factor, certainly.
Okay, I'd like to also open it up for a few questions for Chris, since we didn't give him any. Anybody have additional questions on the mechanical? Okay, go for it.
I noticed at the beginning of your talk when you lined everything up, and you had the cyclical design of this VA mechanical in the middle. You had DFM after bomb creation and everything. Is you're looking at manufacturing tied in, I guess, the feasibility? So assembly process.
If the manufacturer can do it. But I mean, you're right, the DFM does come back in engineering, it's not really hard and fast and sharp. It does need to happen before you.
I'm just curious to what extent you lay out the process and delve into every little step and standardizing screws, that sort of.
Sure, and I guess a lot of that is inherent in what we do. As we source hardware, and I'm talking about physical hardware being screws, epoxy, that sort of thing. In the engineering process, we do try to find what that cost is, whether there is enough, or if there is a secondary product that can be used in case you never want a single source. So, I mean, that could be at DFM or that could be in the engineering process. It really depends. It's up to you.
Okay, I guess we're going to call it a night. Thank you all very much. And you're welcome to hang around a little, ask some personal questions, or network or socialize. And the only other thing I ask is if you would just pick up the area around you, because if you don't, I do.
Thank you. I really appreciate you doing that. Yeah, either pick up a card and I'll email it to you directly. Drew said he's going to send it out to everybody. So whatever. Yeah, it's a crazy rat race. Yeah, I'm just trying to establish a method. It may not be your method, but at least you get an idea of one way that somebody does it.
So surely there is a better method of putting everything inside of it. Like you were saying, like looking at the spreadsheet and then looking back to see if, like, 6 months from now something new came up and like that's very does your company use specialized software to avoid doing that kind of shit?
Yes, but it depends on what context you're talking about. I still fall back on Excel for some needs. On the professional search engines, like the one I pay a lot for every year, it's a worldwide engine, and it will keep track of the results I want to, add all kinds of colors and different things. It has a huge number of options to it, so I can keep track of things in a very refined manner. I can also search for things that are newer than the last date I searched, so that I only see the things that are newer, and I don't have to worry about parsing it out.
How much does that software cost?
It's going to be $5,000 a year minimum.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
And it's not easy to learn unless you've been in the area and done it a lot. It's hard to
Yeah,
one of my alliance partners is a patent agent, and so he got a free demo for a couple weeks to try it out. And he said, what the hell am I supposed to do? I'm trying to use this thing. What am I doing wrong? And I'm like, it's like using some of these specialized software that Chris is talking about. You kind of have to get used to and understanding what it's trying to tell you to do.
Are you an attorney or what is, you're just a patent researcher, you're not an attorney? So you just do research or you also do filing?
No, I do not do filing. We do not do legal things inside our house. We have a patent agent on staff, but I don't let him do filing under our name.
Just research?
Just research. And we work with a lot of IP attorneys, including some in very large firms. So it's always surprising to me what they do not have in-house. And we also work with publicly traded companies all the way down through inventor.
Well, you seem to know your stuff here. You seem to know the background inside and out. Like
After enough years of hearing the dribble, I'm trying to think.
Are you an engineer? How did you get into this?
I'm an electrical engineer.
Electrical engineer.
And
You
so,
don't, and you decide to do this instead of engineering?
yeah, but I went to work for a company for 6 years that worked in the same area, and I learned about the clients, what they needed, how to use the software, and all these other things. And I said at some point, I don't like the company anymore, and so I went off and started my business.
But I mean, when I look at this, I said, man, I could, you know what I mean? I guess it's the first one that's hard, you know what I mean? But I think my eyes would give out long before I got through all that. And the artificial intelligence may actually really help, you know, maybe.
Well, yeah, no, it's always a start. If it saves you time and you're doing it a lot, then it may be worthwhile. It's probably going to be extremely expensive in the near future.
How many hours does it take to actually do a patent search in general?
It depends on what the client wants.
Because let's say something, let's say you're talking drones or aircraft, you'd be more complicated, right?
Yeah, but that's not the main criteria, actually, because the more complicated it is, it may be more unique and easier to ferret out. So the simple things like tables, that can be difficult. Most tables have 4 legs, have a surface that's horizontal, and so figuring out a unique table can actually be kind of difficult. So it's not easy like, oh, that's high tech, it's going to be
So
complicated.
if you come up with a new interplanetary spaceship, there's probably not many of them out there.
Yeah, if you have a spaceship that folds down and sits on the table, probably be able to narrow down on that pretty fast.
If I design an aircraft to go the speed of light, there's probably not many patents out there.
Oh, you'd actually be quite surprised about space travel, time travel, artificial gravity, energy generation from gravity. Yeah, it's just littered with people's ideas.
And they're patentable.
They filed an application. Some of them may have turned into patents. It's not unusual to have an oddball one turn into patent.
So it's 2 times.